Day by day, our magistrates' courts hear thousands of cases. In the name of the Queen, we meet together to seek justice.
Are you Richard Dudley Price?
I am.
Mr. Price, are you legally represented?
No.
Are you applying for legal aid?
No, but it's quite a simple matter. I can manage quite well on my own.
Is the prosecution asking for summary trial? Mr. Price, this is a case which, if you consent, can be tried by their worships in this court. But if you wish, you can be tried before a jury at the Crown Court.
I wish to be tried here.
Now, before you make up your mind, I must warn you that if you are tried here by their worships and convicted, and if they decide, after hearing all about you, that their sentencing powers are insufficient, then they are empowered to send you to a higher court for sentence. Do you understand that?
I understand.
Where do you wish to be tried?
Here.
Mr. Price, you are charged that on March the 23rd, 1973, you stole a photograph in an antique silver frame valued at £21, belonging to Mrs. Stella Winrose. Do you plead guilty or not guilty?
Not guilty.
If it please your worships, I appear for the prosecution in this case.
Well, thank you, Miss Trevor.
Your worships, the prosecution's case is that during the late afternoon of March the 23rd, Mr. Price called at the home of Mrs. Winrose, ostensibly on business. It is alleged that an argument developed during which Mr. Price became very angry and left the house. Afterwards it was found that a photograph in an antique silver frame worth in all £21, the property of Mrs. Winrose, was missing. Believing the photograph to have been taken by Mr. Price, she subsequently telephoned him at his offices, Bannerman, Price and Company of Wembury, asking for the return of her property. He denied all knowledge of the matter, whereupon she laid the facts before the police. That's the prosecution's case, your worships.
Thank you.
I call Mrs. Stella Winrose.
Mrs. Stella Winrose. Mrs. Winrose, please. Mrs. Stella Winrose. Come this way. Just follow the ushers to this one.
What is your religion?
Church of England.
Will you please take the testament in your right hand and repeat the words of the oath?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give in this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
You are Mrs. Stella May Winrose of 14 Baylis Road, Westborough, Middlesex.
I am.
Your occupation?
I haven't worked since my husband's death.
Are you acquainted with the defendant, Mr. Richard Price?
I am.
Do you see Mr. Price in this court?
Yes, I do. He's over there.
On the afternoon of March the 23rd, did Mr. Price call at your home?
He did.
Why did he call?
I rent the bottom flat at 14 Baylis Road. Bannerman and Price are estate agents, and Mr. Price had called to discuss my tenancy.
Was there some problem over this?
Well, there was trouble with my landlady. Mr. Price had been advising me.
So this was not Mr. Price's first call?
No.
Mrs. Winrose, will you tell their worships what happened on the afternoon of the 23rd, please?
I was at home that afternoon answering some letters concerning my husband's death.
Yes?
Well, I heard a car pull up outside. I saw it was Mr. Price in his Cortina. He's got two cars, a Mercedes and a Cortina, but this was the Cortina. He said he'd called on urgent business. We talked for a little. He seemed rather confused. Well, then he started an argument. He got very angry, and I told him he must go.
And did he then go?
Yes, but before he went, he sort of looked around the room and seems to snatch something up, and when he'd gone, I noticed the photograph was missing from the bureau.
I see, thank you.
This photograph and the frame, did you try to reclaim them from Mr. Price?
Yes, I telephoned him at work and asked for it back.
And what did he say?
He said I was making it all up.
Did you make other attempts to get them?
Well, I did think of going over to see him, but Bannerman and Price is at Wembury. That's 15 miles away. And in any case, I didn't want to make a scene.
Have the frame and the photograph ever been recovered?
No.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Will you stay where you are, please?
Mr. Price, you may question the witness now, if you wish.
You mean from here in the dock?
Well, as you're conducting your own defence, perhaps their worships will allow you to step down.
Yes, Mr. Price, you can stand down there by the clerk.
Come this way, sir.
Just there, thank you.
Now, tell me, Mrs. Winrose, how did you and I first meet?
You're a partner in a firm of estate agents. You called to discuss my tenancy.
Yes. Had you contacted my office to arrange this?
No, you're a member of the Counselling and Advisory Service at St. Michael's Church.
Yes. So I called to give advice as a counsellor. And my second visit, did you invite me?
I telephoned you at work. You'd left your phone number and your private extension.
What happened in this second visit?
We discussed my tenancy, as I've said.
Well, didn't you say that you wanted some work of some kind?
Yes, I did.
Yes. Up to the time of your husband's death, you'd been employed as a receptionist.
That's right.
Mr. Price, we were talking about a photograph. We seem to have wandered.
Well, no, not really, sir. You see, I'm trying to establish the basis of the relationship between myself and Mrs. Winrose.
I see. Go on, please.
Thank you, sir. Yes, you told me that you wanted to work at home. Isn't that so?
Well,
Will you answer the question, please?
yes, that's right.
Yes, you had a typewriter, and I'd arranged for my company to give you some copy typing. Do you agree?
I suppose so.
Mrs. Winrose, you must answer properly.
Oh, I do apologize. Yes, I agree.
Yes. And to bring this work to you, to advise you on your problems, to act as counsellor, wasn't this the reason for my visits?
No.
Oh?
You wanted to form a relationship, a special relationship.
Well, by special, do you mean a friendly relationship?
More than friendly, much more.
Oh, no, I'm afraid I can't agree, Mrs. Winrose. You see, the friendly relationship, yes, that's the whole basis of successful counselling, but a special...
Mr. Price, this is not the time to give evidence. You'll be able to tell your side of it later on.
Oh, yes. Yes, thank you. Yes, yes, Mrs. Winrose, did I at any time say to you that your typing was not up to standard?
Well, I was never a professional
The
typist.
fact is,
anyway.
we had to stop giving you work, isn't that so?
Yes, but...
And wasn't that the reason for my visit to you on March the 23rd?
No, it wasn't.
Well, I suggest it was. I suggest it was your unfinished work I took away, not this article, this photograph, whatever it was.
You took that photograph deliberately.
Mrs. Winrose, you said that it was I who wanted a special relationship. You're quite sure it wasn't the other way around?
You know very well it wasn't.
Why'd you bring the police into this?
I want you to return my property.
Yes, but what's the real reason? What's really behind my appearance here in court today?
I've already told you.
Have you, Mrs. Winrose? You're quite sure there isn't something else?
Yes, I am.
Have you any more questions, Mr. Price?
Thank you. I didn't think there's any point. Excuse me, do I go back to my place now?
No. You may have a seat there.
Thank you very much.
Mrs. Winrose, there seems to be some doubt in Mr. Price's mind as to the exact nature of his missing article.
It was a photograph in an antique silver frame.
Yes, the photograph itself. Would you describe it, please?
Yes, it was taken at Hastings by a beach photographer. He stopped us as we walked along the front.
He stopped whom?
Mr. Price and me.
When was this?
On August the 26th, Mr. Price had driven me down there in his Mercedes.
Was this part of the friendship that was mentioned earlier?
Yes, we'd been out and about quite a bit.
Where else, apart from the trip to Hastings?
Dinner, to the theatre, out in his car a few times.
Had this friendship any bearing on the alleged argument of March the 23rd?
Oh, yes, definitely.
So it was not about a business issue after all?
No. It was very personal.
Could you enlarge on this, please?
Well, Mr. Price had made certain advances to me.
Do you mean amorous advances?
Yes.
And what was your reaction?
Well, I resisted them.
And Mr. Price?
He wanted to go on.
Was it this which started the argument?
It was a flaming row, not just an argument.
I see.
Mrs. Winrose, could you be more explicit, please?
Yes, sir. Well, when Mr. Price came to see me, we talked a little, as I've said. Well, then he tried to make love to me. He was rough and brutal. I think he'd been drinking.
Yes, carry on.
Well, I tried to push him away, but he swore at me. I thought he was going to get violent, so I said, if you don't leave my flat at once, I should telephone for the police. Well, he stopped at that and he stormed out, taking the photograph.
I see. And about what time was this, please?
It was late afternoon, around 6 o'clock.
Thank you.
Mrs. Winrose, Mr. Price seemed to suggest that the idea of a special relationship between you came in fact from you.
That's not true.
When Mr. Price first called on you, how long had you lost your husband?
About a month or 6 weeks. He died in a car crash.
Was it possible so soon after your bereavement that you could consider a relationship of the kind implied?
It's utterly out of the question.
Thank you. I've nothing further.
Excuse me. Am I allowed to ask further questions? I feel that certain implications have been made.
Well, unless Miss Trevor has any objections?
No objections.
Your Worship?
Yes, Mr. Price, I think we'll permit that. But you must confine yourself to matters arising from Miss Trevor's questioning. Do you understand?
Yes, I do. Thank you, sir. Now, Mrs. Winrose, it seems that we've been out and about together.
Yes, we have.
Mm-hmm. Where do we go, please?
Dinner to the theatre, as I've said.
Yes, which theatre?
The local theatre.
Yes. Presumably, you prove I was there.
Well, I can't prove it, no, but you certainly were there.
Yes, but you've no proof of this.
Look, it's the truth.
Oh, yes, I'm sure. Yes, now, this photograph, when was it taken, please?
On this August the 26th, the Saturday of the bank holiday.
And what would you say if I told you I was at a conference in London the weekend it was supposed to have been taken?
Well, I should say you were lying.
So I have the conference papers here. I have a receipt for the fee made out in my name.
Mr. Price, you may give evidence later. You're questioning the witness now.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, thank you. Yes, trips in the car, dinner, theatre. Seems that socially we were very well acquainted.
More than just acquainted. Much more.
I see.
Well, to put it bluntly, you wanted an affair. Almost right from the start you tried to paw and kiss me. You know very well you did. You said your wife was a cold person and you needed someone like me.
Yes, might I suggest, Mrs. Winrose, it was you who needed someone?
No.
Well, I suggest it was. I suggest it was you who made the advances, you who repulsed, you who out of spite, revenge, or what have you, have trumped up this ridiculous charge.
You stole that photograph.
Yes, but was there a photograph?
Yes, there was.
Look, do you seriously suggest that a respectable businessman, a member of an important counselling service, would dishonour his responsibilities for the sake of a sordid little affair?
It happened.
I've no further questions.
Any questions, Your Worships?
No questions. Thank you, Mrs. Winrose.
Would you call Abbas Khan?
Abbas Khan, please. Abbas Khan.
What religion are you?
I have Muslim religion.
Well, would you give the witness the copy of the Quran?
Yes, sir. Will you please take the Quran in your right hand and repeat the words of the oath? Right hand, please.
I swear by Allah and the Holy Prophet Muhammad that the evidence I shall give in this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
You are Abbas Khan of 16 Baylis Road, Westborough.
Yes, miss.
Your occupation?
Please?
What's your job?
I am storeman.
Do you know Mrs. Stella Winrose, and do you see her in this court?
Yes, Mrs. Winrose is there.
Is there anyone else you recognise? A gentleman?
Yes, miss. It is Mr. Bannerman Price.
When did you first meet Mrs. Winrose?
Well, you see, I am neighbour to this lady, but I meet her properly because of the flood.
The flood?
Yes. You see, Mrs. Winrose, she knocked at my door one time. There's a flood of water coming through the ceiling. So I find the stopcock for the house and turn it off for her.
I see.
She say the flood is the fault of the lady upstairs.
Oh, what is the name of this lady?
She is Mrs. Peck. She owns the house. Mrs. Winrose say the flood is done on purpose.
Later, did someone come to see Mrs. Winrose about this matter?
Yes, miss. Mr. Bannerman Price.
No, Mr. Khan. Mr. Price is Mr. Richard Dudley Price. Bannerman Price is the name of the company.
Yes, sir, of course. A state man. Very big.
Did Mr. Price visit Mrs. Winrose more than once?
Oh, yes. He comes many times. tells Sayadra, my wife, of this.
Miss Trevor, please do not allow your witness to give hearsay evidence.
I'm sorry, Your Worships.
Please?
Mr. Khan, the evidence you give must come directly from you, not from what your wife said.
Oh, so, yes, miss.
Do you yourself know that Mr. Price visited Mrs. Winrose more than once?
Yes, I do know, because I've seen his car, you see.
What make of car was it, do you know?
First time, a Cortina. Mrs. Winrose tells me Mr. Price has a Mercedes, but it goes in for service.
Ah, yes. Now, you had a conversation with Mrs. Winrose about Mr. Price.
Oh, yes, he helps her. She shows me the colour television he buys for her.
You say Mr. Price bought a colour television set for Mrs. Winrose.
Oh, yes. Very good set. Very expensive.
Did you see Mr. Price act in any way other than as a businessman, a consultant? Yes, well, did you?
Please, I would not wish to speak about this.
I'm afraid you must, Mr. Khan. This is why you're here.
Mr. Khan, do you understand the question?
Yes.
Then you must answer, please.
At one time, I see Mr. Price kiss Mrs. Winrose.
Where were they at this time?
In the kitchen, the back of the house. I am upstairs to have my bath. I go to draw my curtain, and I see them kiss.
Yes, and what happened then?
I do not know. I pull the curtain.
Do you remember Mr. Price visiting on a subsequent occasion?
Yes, miss. He come to see Mrs. Peck.
The landlady?
Yes.
I meant, do you remember him visiting Mrs. Winrose on another occasion?
Yes, he called on March 23rd.
How did you know that Mr. Price was at the house?
His Cortina's outside, you see.
And where were you at this time?
I am coming back from my work. I stop because I think I hear them quarrel.
Did it sound like a big quarrel, a violent quarrel?
A big quarrel. Yes, I think.
Thank you. Please stay where you are. Oh, I'm sorry, Your Worships, there is one further matter.
Yes, Miss Trevor.
Mr. Khan, have you often been in Mrs. Winrose's flat?
Not many times, please, and always with Sayadra, my wife, you understand.
Did you see a photograph ever? A picture of Mrs. Winrose by the sea?
Oh, yes, in the silver frame, Mrs. Winrose is with Mr. Price.
Thank you.
Now, Mr. Khan, how long have you been in England, please?
I'm here 11 months. I'm Ugandan Asian.
Yes, and you're employed as a storeman, is that right?
Yes, a storeman.
Now, you say that you'll see me in a Ford Cortina, and you mentioned a Mercedes.
Yes, sir.
Yes. Now, what would you say, Mr. Khan, if I told you, in fact, my car is a Jaguar?
Perhaps it is because you have 3 cars.
No, sir, I have one car. It's a Jaguar. I can prove it.
Mr. Price, please stick to questioning.
Yes, I'm sorry. Take us. Yes, so you know all about cars, eh?
Yes, please, I do.
You're a storeman, recently from Uganda. What makes you so knowledgeable, eh?
Well, I know about cars because in Kampala I have my own service station. This I lose with my home and my savings when we are made to leave. I am storeman at Motorworks now, but I work hard, and sometime I am owner again.
Yes. Yes, all right, you know about cars, but might you have been confused about their drivers?
But, Mr. Price, I see you driving these cars.
Yes, well, I suggest, Mr. Khan, that I'm an ordinary-looking chap. You may have seen someone else of my stamp and build.
But I see Mrs. Winrose with you one time.
Yes, I dare say you did see Mrs. Winrose, but with someone who merely looked like me. But, be that as it may. Now then, this date, March the 23rd, how can you be so sure of that?
I can be very sure.
Oh, how?
It is my birthday.
I see. Yes, now then, this view from the bathroom window when you saw me kiss Mrs. Winrose. Tell me, have you seen other things?
You answer the question, please.
I see a man one time. I think perhaps it is you.
You think, perhaps.
The man, he has his back to the window.
Yeah. Was Mrs. Winrose present?
She stand close to the man.
Tell me, what makes you think the man was me?
Well, if it is not you, Mr. Price, then it means someone else visits Mrs. Winrose.
Exactly, Mr. Khan. I'm very grateful.
Returning to the first occasion, are you quite sure it was Mr. Price you saw kissing Mrs. Winrose?
Yes, I'm sure.
Thank you, Mr. Khan.
No questions.
That's all, Mr. Khan.
Thank you, Mr. Khan.
Would you call Detective Constable Barton?
Detective Constable Barton.
Detective Constable Barton. Detective Constable Barton.
Sergeant, have you got all the witnesses for case fatigue?
Whereupon Mrs. Winrose came to the police station. As a result of what was said, it was decided to make inquiries, and I was detailed to call on Mr. Price at his home address.
What date was this?
March the 26th, 3 days after the alleged incident.
When you questioned Mr. Price, how did he reply?
Well, his answers were vague, almost evasive, you might say.
Officer, perhaps you'll tell us exactly what he said.
Yes, sir. I said, Mrs. Winrose alleges that on March the 23rd you went to her flat, and that there was an argument, after which you stole a silver photograph frame valued at £21. He replied, it's damned ridiculous that police should waste their time and public money on such a trivial matter. I then said, an allegation of an indictable offence has been made and the police have to follow it up. Thank you.
How did Mr. Price react?
Well, he seemed a bit shaken, and then he said, I know nothing of the incident, nothing whatever.
What did you do then?
I cautioned him. I told him I was not satisfied with his answers and invited him to accompany me. Later at the police station, Mr. Price was charged, cautioned, and he made no reply. Mr. Price was then released on bail on his own reconnaissance.
At the police station, did you take a description of the stolen article in detail?
Yes. Mrs. Winrose later produced a copy of the photograph alleged to be in the frame.
Have you that copy with you?
I have.
Would you let the defendant see the photograph, please? Thank you.
There's a news vendor's bill in the background. The wording's clear. We've checked, and the bill was put out on August the 26th.
Thank you, officer.
Officer, you called at my house in a police car, is that right?
Yes.
Would you agree that an entirely unexpected police visit with an allegation of theft would be something of a shock to even an innocent party?
Possible, yes.
And while his mind is racing away, trying to think of what he might have done, quite unwittingly, a man might easily make what could be construed as evasive answers.
Yes, I suppose so.
Yes, now, when you called at my house, was there a car outside the garage?
Yes.
Was it a Ford Cortina or a Mercedes?
Neither. It was a Jaguar.
A Jaguar. Oh, yes. Your Worships, I wonder if the photograph could be handed back to the constable, please.
Yes, certainly.
Thank you. Will you please tell the court what you see in that photograph?
Well, it's a picture of a man and a woman with a beach and sea in the background.
Yes, do you recognize the two parties?
Well, the woman is clearly Mrs. Winrose, that lady there.
The man?
It's a man of your height and build.
Ah. How's he dressed?
In casual clothes, slacks and a sports shirt.
Has he a moustache?
Yes.
Like mine.
It seems darker, more trendy.
And the hair? The same colour as yours. Oh, does it recede a little like mine?
Well, I think it's combed down over the forehead.
Yes, there are, in short, points of difference.
Apparent difference. It could be you as a younger man.
Yes, younger. How much younger? A few months, would you say?
No. 5, 10 years, maybe.
Then are you still sure in your mind that the man in that picture is me?
No, I'm not.
Thank you.
No questions.
Thank you, officer. Leave the photograph behind, will you?
Your Worships, that completes the case for the prosecution.
Your Worships, the defendant is not represented. I must advise you that you ought to consider whether there is a case to answer.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, now, How do you feel about this?
Well, he seems to have had the opportunity, doesn't he?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not entirely satisfied.
No, there was the evidence of the complainant. She seemed very positive.
And the Indian chap?
Yes. We go ahead then, you agree?
I do, yes.
Mr. Price, we have decided that there is a case to answer. There are 3 courses open to you at this stage. In the first place, you don't have to say anything at all if you don't wish to.
Will you rise, please?
But if you do wish to give the court an account of what happened, then you will do so under oath, in which case you'll go in the witness box and you're liable to be asked questions. Or you can make a statement where you stand, not under oath, in which case you won't be asked questions. But you'll appreciate that in general, evidence is likely to have more weight if it can be tested by cross-examination. Do you understand?
Yes, I wish to give evidence on oath.
Very well.
Will you go into the witness box, please?
Come this way, sir.
What is your religion?
Church of England.
Will you please take the testament in your right hand and repeat the words on the oath?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give in this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
You're Richard Dudley Price?
I am.
Address?
Waverley, Wheatfield Road, Burton Hill.
Occupation?
Auctioneer and estate agent.
Thank you. Now, what would you like to tell us?
Well, Your Worships, as Mrs. Winrose has told you, I am a member of the counselling service operated by my local church. I know the value of good counselling. I'm also aware of its possible dangers. Your Worships, it's quite true that I called on Mrs. Winrose a number of times, mainly on business matters. But as time went by, I noticed that Mrs. Winrose was becoming increasingly, well, affectionate. This, in her circumstances, I could well understand, but I was also very much aware of the risk involved, the risk to me. But despite this, I continued to call on Mrs. Winrose to bring her work and so on, but on the March the 23rd meeting, I had to tell her that her typing was too much below standard, as you heard. Unfortunately, I think that Mrs. Winrose felt I was using this as an excuse to break off the relationship, and she became angry at first and then, well, rather emotional. Obviously, my presence was aggravating her, so I thought it best to leave. Not, of course, of this photograph we've heard so much about. Well, the next thing was we get this visit from the police. I was astonished. It seemed such a poor reward for time and effort considerately spent.
Did you ever see the silver photograph frame that is alleged to have been stolen?
No, I'm sorry, I just don't know what you're talking about.
And is that your case, Mr. Price?
Yes, that's my whole case.
Thank you.
Mr. Price, you've mentioned the possible dangers of counselling, and yet we've heard that on at least one occasion you embraced and kissed Mrs. Winrose. Is that so?
Yes, it is, but it was a compassionate gesture, you understand.
Would you explain what you mean by a compassionate gesture?
Yes, certainly. Mrs. Winrose told me once about her many problems. She was very depressed at this time, and as I listened to her, I saw a look on her face. And, well, there came over me what I can only describe as a wave of compassion, and I just kissed her.
I see. And then?
Oh, that was all.
This was the only time you kissed Mrs. Winrose?
The only time.
Mrs. Winrose has said otherwise.
Well, I've just tried to be helpful and considerate, and that's all. I've lent her money, advised her on her tenancy, had colour television installed for her.
A witness has said you bought her a colour TV set.
Had it installed and paid the first fee. I really think that Mrs. Winrose has read far too much into this, as I've tried to show.
This photograph we've seen, how do you explain that?
It's just not me, that's all. I was in London at a conference the weekend it was supposed to have been taken. I have the papers.
Is there perhaps your signature on the attendance sheet? Well?
Well, no, actually, I don't think I signed the attendance sheet. But that doesn't mean to say I wasn't there.
Nor that you were there. You said your car is a Jaguar.
Yes, I think that's been confirmed.
You've never owned a Mercedes?
No.
Have you hired one?
No.
You refute Mrs. Winrose's story. According to you, she's made the whole thing up. Can you think of any reason why she should have done that?
None.
Thank you.
Sir?
No questions?
Will you stand down, Mr. Price?
Thank you. May I now call witnesses?
Oh, please do.
I call the Reverend John Hyde.
Reverend John Hyde. Reverend Hyde, please. Reverend John Hyde. You come this way, son. Follow the usher down. No, not yet, not yet, love. Just sit down. I'll let you know when you're required. Sergeant.
What is your name, please?
John Hyde.
Your address?
St. Michael's Vicarage, Burton Hill.
Occupation?
Clerk in Holy Orders.
Now, what is the evidence you would like this witness to give?
It's character evidence, mostly. Mr. Hyde, are you acquainted with my wife and me?
I've known you both since I first came to the parish, which is a little over 2 years.
Do we attend your church?
You do, and you yourself work in the diocese.
Yes. Would you tell the court, please, something about this work?
Yes. Your worships, from my own experience and that of my church council, it was found that although a good deal was done to help widows, certain needs were rather neglected. We decided to set up a voluntary counselling and advice service to help widows with any special problems they might have.
Thank you.
Mr. Hyde, with regard to this service, were you approached by a Mrs. Stella Winrose?
Yes, she had a tenancy problem. You were experienced in property management and tenancy matters, so I referred the case to you. You reported that it was a problem of harassment and bad neighbourliness and that you'd been able to offer help. We were extremely grateful.
Have I been able to help other widows?
Yes, there were at least 3 other cases.
And were there ever any complaints as to my conduct or behaviour?
Indeed there weren't.
Thank you.
Mr. Hyde, this service you operate, what sort of people are your counsellors?
Purely voluntary, professional and business people like Mr. Price, retired nurses, all kinds.
Have they special qualifications for this work?
We feel that attitude and approach are rather more important than particular qualifications.
Your counsellors are carefully chosen.
Oh, yes. Otherwise you might attract the wrong type.
Wrong?
Well, people with personality defects. They mean well, but widows are very vulnerable.
You mean as women?
They're often astonished by the speed at which even their late husband's best friends make certain suggestions.
And is it your experience that some widows, especially the younger ones, have made what might be termed advances to your counsellors?
No.
And you wouldn't associate your counsellors with taking advantage of a widow's position?
Goodness, no.
And that includes Mr. Price?
Most certainly. To my knowledge, Mr. Price is a responsible man, important professionally and socially.
Thank you, Mr. Hyde.
You may re-examine the witness, Mr. Price.
That's just one question, Your Worship. Mr. Hyde, have you any reason to suppose that I'm other than a happily married man?
None whatever.
Thank you.
No questions?
Thank you, Mr. Hyde.
This way.
You have other witnesses?
Yes, I call Mrs. Matilda Peck.
Mrs. Matilda Peck. Mrs. Peck, please. Miss Matilda Peck. I've already told you. Just sit down. I'll call you when you're required. Sergeant, please. Just go in there. Follow the usher to the witness box, please.
Mrs. Peck, is Mrs. Winrose a tenant of yours?
Yes, she rents my lower flat, unfurnished.
She a good tenant?
No, neither of them were. Rowing all the time they were. And, of course, Mr. Winrose used to drink a lot.
So you've been led to believe that they were happily married?
Happy? She couldn't bear him.
How did you get on with Mrs. Winrose after her husband's death?
No better, not really. She has men call. I don't like it.
Yes, but it's no crime for a widow to have friends, surely.
Friends?
And surely I was one of these visitors.
Well, yes, but you came on business.
Yes, we've heard in this court that up to the time of her husband's death, Mrs. Winrose was employed as a receptionist.
Receptionist? Hostess, you mean?
If it please your worships, Mr. Price is not represented, and I have endeavoured to show every forbearance, but I must protest at the introduction into this case of what seems to be nothing more than malicious gossip.
Your worships, I'm going to find it very difficult to conduct my case if this lady interrupts me.
Mr. Price, no one wants to interrupt the proper presentation of your case, but you must keep it within bounds.
Yes, but Mrs. Winrose has accused me of dishonesty. Surely I have a right to show the court the sort of person she is.
This witness is intended to show the character of the complainant. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Very well, then. Please carry on.
Thank you, sir. Yes, Mrs. Peck, was Mrs. Winrose very distressed by her husband's death?
Distressed? After she come back from the cremation service, I went down to see her. Mrs. Winrose, I says, we've not always got on together, you and me, but you've lost your hubby, and I know what it is. I'm sorry.
Yes.
Well, your worship, she looks at me as tough as they come, lights a cigarette, and don't you be sorry for me, she says. I'm glad he's gone. He was a bastard.
Thank you, Mrs. Peck. Your witness.
Mrs. Peck, did Mr. Price visit Mrs. Winrose often?
He may have, a bit.
Didn't you wonder at this?
Mr. Price was helping her, wasn't he? But she was just teasing him, leading him on, and then putting the bar up.
Oh, how do you know this?
Well, she said you got more out of a man if you played a bit hard to get. Her very words.
Doesn't this suggest that Mr. Price's visits weren't always business visits?
Eh? I don't know what goes on behind closed doors, do I?
We've heard that there was a flood of water at number 14 Baylis Road.
That's right, my lavatory system overflowed.
It's been suggested that the overflow was deliberately arranged as part of a programme of harassment.
You mean I blocked up the pipe myself?
I haven't said that.
That's nonsense.
If Mrs. Winrose left her flat, couldn't you let it for a much higher rent?
Well, what if I could?
When did Mr. Price visit you, Mrs. Peck?
I don't rightly recall.
Was it towards the end of March, perhaps the beginning of April?
I don't rightly recall.
Could you tell us what was discussed?
It was business.
Was there perhaps a suggestion that Mr. Price might be able to help you with your unwanted tenant?
You've no right to say that.
If Mr. Price did make that suggestion, is that perhaps why you're here?
Yes, you must answer.
Did Mr. Price promise his help if you would help him?
Well, he may have hinted, but he didn't actually say.
Thank you, Mrs. Peck.
Mr. Price? Sir?
Nothing.
You may stand down, madam. You've other witnesses, Mr. Price?
Yes, I call my last witness Miss Dora Price.
Miss Dora Price. Miss Price, please. Miss Dora Price. Just come this way. Off the outside of the witness box, please.
Round here. What is your religion?
I've no religion.
Well, in place of taking the oath, would you be willing to affirm?
Yes.
May she affirm, sir?
Oh, yes, please carry on.
Read the words on the card, please.
I, Dora Angela Price, solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give in this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Thank you.
Your name, please?
Dora Angela Price, spinster.
Address?
Flat 19, Craven Court, Westborough.
Occupation?
School teacher.
Thank you.
Miss Price, are we related, please?
Yes, you're my father.
Yes. As you can see, I'm acting as my own defence solicitor, as it were. Yes. Were you at home, the family home, on the afternoon of March the 23rd?
I was, yes.
Are you quite sure of that date?
It was the week of the school play. I was calling on my mother.
What time did I arrive home, please?
About 6 o'clock, I think, was your usual time.
Did you notice anything special about my behaviour?
Not particularly. You said, "Hello, Dora." I said hello, and that was that.
So was I agitated or upset in any way?
Mr. Price, are these questions relevant?
Well, Your Worship, it's alleged that around 6 o'clock on March the 23rd I was involved in a violent quarrel with Mrs. Winrose. I feel that the question of time is important, also my state of mind when I got home.
I see. Please carry on.
Thank you, sir. So, was my behaviour anything out of the ordinary?
You seemed your usual self.
What happened then?
We had our meal, and then you went out.
And where did I go, please?
Well, you said you were going to a counselling meeting.
So the routine, my whole behaviour, in short, was perfectly normal.
So far as anyone's is normal.
Oh, yes, these cars. What type of car do I own, please?
It's a Jaguar.
Have I ever owned a Mercedes?
No. You said you'd like to.
I hired one.
Not to my knowledge. You drive an old Mark IX Jaguar, which you bought for £50.
No, I think that's all. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Miss Price, does your father have difficulty in masking his feelings?
What do you mean?
Well, it might be that usually he's well able to control his emotions. Would you agree?
Well, perhaps to a certain extent.
Yes, and on occasion, can he also be rather hot-tempered?
Yes, if he's greatly provoked.
Now, Mr. Price, as we can see, is well groomed. His hair and moustache are neatly trimmed. Has he at any time grown his hair longer, perhaps combed it forward?
Lots of men experiment with their hairstyles these days.
Yes, did your father?
At one time.
When was this time?
I believe during last summer.
Had he darkened his moustache?
Oh, yes, I seem to remember he did once.
Did you form an opinion about this?
There was talk of redundancies about that time. I thought my father might be trying to look younger to help with his job.
Your father was concerned about redundancies?
Well, why not? Nobody's safe these days.
Could Miss Price have sight of the photograph, please? Whom do you see in this photograph, Miss Price?
A man and a woman.
Would you look about the court and see if you can identify the lady?
It seems to be that lady there, sitting in front of my mother. My mother's the lady in the grey hat.
And who is the man?
I don't really know.
Miss Price, I suggest you do know. I suggest that the man in the photograph is your father as he looked at that time.
Miss Price, this is a very important point. We're trying to establish the truth in this case. Who is the man in the photograph, please?
I think it's my father.
Has your father ever owned a Cortina?
No, but he uses the firm's Cortina for his rent collections.
His rent collections?
Oh, yes, my father's a rent collector and bookkeeper.
Mr. Price of Bannerman, Price and Company?
Price is a common name. That's pure coincidence.
This court has been led to assume that your father was a partner in the firm.
Oh?
It could be that other people have believed this also. Miss Price, it's alleged that your father formed an association with Mrs. Winrose, gave her money, presents, and took her out, drove her about in an expensive car. What are your feelings about this?
He simply couldn't afford it.
Apart from Mr. Price's job, there's no other source of income.
Well, my mother goes out to work to help make ends meet, but it's quite impossible for my father to associate with Mrs. Winrose or anyone else in the way you've described.
And it's a fact, is it, that Mr. Price's position is not a responsible one?
Oh, it's responsible. I mean, as a rent collector, he has to handle substantial amounts of cash, but he certainly couldn't...
Yes, please go on.
I finished, really.
You were saying that your father handled substantial amounts of cash.
Yes. It was just to explain that his position was responsible.
Ah, yes. I see. Well, I think that's all. Thank you.
Mr. Price?
No.
Thank you, Miss Price.
Right, this way, please.
Mr. Price, have you any further witnesses to call? Do you wish to say anything to their worships? Or would you stand, please?
Worships, Your Worships, I do assure you, and everyone in this court, assure you that when I first called on Mrs. Winrose, I did so solely with the desire to help her. The fact that events took a different course was quite unpredictable. During my visits, I became very fond of Mrs. Winrose, and I thought quite mistakenly that the feeling was mutual. We went out together, and I'm afraid I lived rather expensively. I'd also advanced Mrs. Winrose a great deal of money. There were complications, and I was compelled to ask for some of the money back. She laughed at me, and then I knew the true situation. Quarreled quite violently. As I left, I saw the photograph, and on an impulse, I snatched it up. I just wanted to. Your Worships, I know that I've pleaded not guilty, but I did so not just to safeguard my job and my reputation, but also to protect my wife. I didn't want her to become further involved in this mess. That's all I have to say.
Would you remain standing, please?
We find this case is proved. Is there anything known?
The defendant is of previous good character, sir. He seems to have had rather a number of jobs, if your worships wish me to mention these.
No, thank you. I don't think that'll be necessary. Mr. Price, we appreciate the circumstances behind this case and the possible repercussions, but we cannot ignore the fact that as a counsellor advising widows, some of them newly bereaved, you had a very serious responsibility. That on this occasion you failed to maintain that responsibility. However, you're a man of previous good character, and though there are very serious aspects to this case, we have in mind to fine you. How much do you earn, please?
I take home about £26 a week, Your Worship.
And your wife?
She has a small part-time job.
Thank you. You're fined £20.
Yes.
Can you pay that sum, or any part of it now?
I can't possibly pay. You see, my firm...
Would you like time to pay?
Yes, I must have time.
Well, what can you offer?
Yeah. £1 a week.
Mr. Price, I'm sure you can do better than that. Make it payable at the rate of £2 a week for the next 10 weeks, please.
Yes, sir.
After you leave the court, will you go with the officer to the cashier's office?
Yes.
You come this way, sir. Sergeant, cashier's office, £20, £2 a week. Case number 12, sir, Mr.
Told you.
Thank you. Mrs. Tidd, please. Mrs. Emily Tidd. Just come this way. Excuse me. Oh. Just standing there. Excuse me, Your Worship's case number 17, which Your Worship's particularly wanted to hear before lunch. The prosecuting police officer concerned is still engaged in court number 2. This is a contested case involving several witnesses, and my latest information is it's liable to go on for some time yet.
Can we still fit it into this afternoon's list?
Oh, yes, Your Worship. They're mostly motoring offences, and there are only 2 contested ones.
Can we be sure that the officer will be available at that time?
I hope so, Your Worships. We're just checking on it now. This is the only other morning case, number 12, Mrs. Emily Tidd, and I understand the defendant is asking for an adjournment because one of her witnesses is sick.
Can we hear this case in 2 weeks' time? How are the lists?
Oh, no, they're very full in 2 weeks. 4 weeks would be all right.
4 weeks is rather long.
Or perhaps it could be heard in number 2 court, Your Worships.
Yes. Well, Mrs. Tidd, if we can hear your case earlier, we will, and you'll be told of the date. In the meantime, we're going to adjourn for 4 weeks, which will give your witness ample time to recover.